Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1131 has a ton of fascinating details ranging from new Elbaf lore, revelations about Shanks, and even the potential for the return of Shiki and some of the elements from Strongworld. So let's just get right into it. We kick things off with our 18th entry to Yamato's cover story as we find Yamato chasing down the sword thief from the last chapter atop Komachio. Tama has also joined in on the hunt with the help of Speed, who, if you recall, after the events of the raid of Onigashima, had agreed to stay behind as a mother figure for the young girl. Last we saw her, she was celebrating the liberation of Wano alongside Tama, Komachio, and Hamlet, and I'd been wondering if we'd see her again in this cover story a few weeks ago, so it's great to see her addition here. Shinobu is notably absent after having been seen training Tama a few chapters ago. Perhaps she returned to the Flower Capital, though I have seen some people wonder if she had some motivation for taking Yasue's sword. Seems unlikely to me, but you never know. Now, looking at the background here, you can see that they are departing from the forested area that was Amigasa Village and are now heading toward a more barren landscape. Given these tall rock formations, it seems probable to me that they have now chased the thief into the region of Udon, which conveniently is Yamato's next stop anyways. There's not much to say with this one, as we are simply transitioning from one scene to another, but as always, I am looking forward to entering the next region and revisiting some more of our friends from the Wano arc. We've been speculating that Raizo may have been made the daimyo of Udon, so hopefully we'll get to see him soon. That said, let's talk about chapter 1131, Loki in the Underworld. We pick things back up where we left off with Loki. Luffy, in all of his excitement over finally being on Elbaf, asks if there's anything at the top of the tree. Now, this was the same question that I had posed in the previous chapter, as Oda omitted the very top of the tree in that spread, though we do get to see it in this chapter on the next page. From here, it looks fairly normal, but you can see the leaves are a bit lighter than the ones in the lower parts of the tree. I wonder if there's any significance to this, or if this is just a means to depict the high altitude of the tree, with the top of it being covered in frost. Perhaps this could also be the source of the waterfalls as the ice melts. In any case, I would not be surprised if there's more to it than just what we see here. In the last chapter, Loki introduced himself as the Sun God, who brings the world to an end. At the time, it was not necessarily clear what his intention was with this title, but here in this chapter, it's further suggested that this name is only self-prescribed, as he cites it as being the same one from the legends passed down throughout the history of Elbaf. We first heard about the Sun God's connection to Elbaf myth not too long ago during Vegapunk's broadcast, and when Dory and Brogy reunited with Luffy, they spoke of Luffy's appearance being that of an Elbaf god. So for Loki to believe himself to be the Sun God, it would mean that he at least has some of the known qualities of this fabled deity, unless of course he's just a crazy megalomaniac, which I suppose is certainly possible as well. But in the event that Loki has a reason for believing himself to be this god, it could be that whatever devil fruit it is that Loki acquired after killing his father gives him the properties of Nika to some extent. There are a lot of possibilities here, with perhaps him having the real rubber fruit, or maybe even a different godlike model of the human fruit, and whatever it ends up being, I'm sort of expecting it to at least mimic Luffy's abilities in some form. Most of Luffy's antagonists throughout the series are direct foils to him, usually in terms of philosophy or worldview, but there are a few instances of Luffy having an opponent whose powers vaguely resemble his, the most notable of these being Bellamy and Katakuri, and so perhaps Loki can be the next character to fill this sort of role. Now, Dory, Brogy, and the rest of the Giant Warrior Pirates were shown to be very receptive to Luffy assuming the form of the Sun God Nika, so it's likely that the people of Elbaf don't necessarily buy into Loki's Sun God proclamation, given that they imprisoned him for his heinous acts against the former king. In fact, in this chapter, we learn that he's been locked up for 6 years, which is a very interesting time frame, especially given the relevance of Shanks in this chapter. It would seem that Loki murdered King Harold in order to acquire the legendary devil fruit of Elbaf 6 years prior to present day, which would be the same year that Shanks became an emperor of the sea. Now, this could be more than just a coincidence. Perhaps Shanks was involved in defeating Loki, who has been made out to be one of, if not the most dangerous giants on Elbaf. This in turn could have been what allowed Shanks to attain emperor status, as it would have allowed for him to claim Elbaf under his protection, giving him an alliance with a nation that the world government has been at odds with for centuries. Now, we can tell that Shanks has visited Loki fairly recently, as Loki's followers mentioned they had fallen unconscious before him last time, a nod to his monstrous conqueror's haki that we've seen throughout the series. And as far as we know, he was on Elbaf about 3 or 4 days ago, during the Straw Hat's first day on Egghead. Shanks was just about to be on his way when Kid arrived and the two had their clash. On the following day, we saw that his crew had departed Elbaf and was out at sea during Vegapunk's broadcast, and we learned a few chapters ago that he had gone to Gartel Island to deal with Bartolomeo. Now of note, this was 2 days prior to the present day, as the Straw Hats and the Giant Warrior Pirates found themselves victims to the Sleeping Mists for that amount of time. So as of now, Shanks' current location or destination is not clear. We know he's been after Blackbeard and had anticipated his presence back on Wano, so perhaps that's still his main motivation at this moment. Now, we never really got the reason for Shanks' presence on Elbaf in the first place. As we know, his goal after Wano was to deal with Bartolomeo, so there must have been a pretty decent reason to make a stop at Warland. Well, Shanks does say that he ended up staying longer than expected because he met up with old friends. However, the phrasing here is purposely ambiguous, as it doesn't necessarily inform us of who these friends in question are. Now, this is the same chapter that we learned Dory and Brogy have returned to Elbaf, so we're led to believe that he's referring to a reunion between him and the giant captains, but it's not evident why either party would think the other to be dead. Considering how Dory and Brogy were dueling on Little Garden for the last century or so, for Shanks to have befriended them, he would have had to encounter them on Little Garden within the last 4 decades, and likely would have learned about their duel. Even if Shanks expected one of the giants to have died given their duel was to the death, there really is not any apparent reason why Dory and Brogy would believe Shanks to have died. All things considered, he is fairly young for a human, and I'm sure his Emperor status would have made them aware of him at one point or another. As such, we've always suspected that there may be someone else being referred to with this line. With the new possibility of Shanks having visited Loki, could this old friend in question be the accursed prince himself? After all, Loki was sentenced to crucifixion all those years ago and has been left to die ever since. This would be more than enough reason for Shanks to believe Loki to have been dead, and with Loki seemingly viewing Shanks as a lesser individual, it would follow that he did not have much faith in him surviving. Now, as for why Shanks would view Loki as a friend while Loki seems to despise him, this could be a product of their personalities, similar to how Luffy views some of his rivals as companions, despite their animosity. Now, when Luffy hears Shanks' name, his face brightens up, and Loki takes note of Luffy's change in demeanor, so perhaps Loki doesn't have any hatred for Shanks at all, and is being mischievous here in order to trick Luffy into helping him. In all honesty, there are a lot of ways this could go. Given Loki's personality and predicament, it's not easy to get a clear read of when he's being truthful or not. Maybe he actually does view Shanks as a coward and feels betrayed by him for not helping him escape in the first place. Regardless, given Luffy's line in this chapter, I think we are supposed to believe that Shanks was on Elbaf for some greater purpose. Perhaps it's as straightforward as checking on Loki to see if everything on Elbaf was in order. We'll just have to see. Now, Luffy lashing out at Shanks being called a coward is a clear callback to Chapter 1, when he defended Shanks' honor against Higuma, who threw the same insult at the red-haired captain behind his back. In that first chapter, we saw that Shanks did not mind if he or his pride was insulted or even threatened, but instead only chose to act when his friend was put in danger. This was a lesson imparted upon Luffy that we saw in practice on Jaya against Bellamy, and some people may view the events of this chapter as Luffy regressing, but I think the point of this is to illustrate that Luffy is still willing to fight back to defend someone else, especially someone who isn't there to defend themselves in front of the insult. This is very much like how Ace acted when Whitebeard was insulted by Sakazuki, and even how Roger was said to have been as well, having destroyed entire armies for bad-mouthing his friends. This insult prompts him to go full gear forth and strike at Loki with a Kongun. Now, we haven't seen Luffy assume this form since his fight against S-Bear alongside Lucci, so it's nice to see him bring it back into rotation, even after having shown the ability to use partial gear forth transformations. Now, we also have to talk about Loki's special bounty. First off, it is a fairly high one, clocking in at 2.6 billion, and for some greater context, this is just below Luffy, Law, and Kid's 3 billion, and just above Blackbeard's first 2.247 billion berry bounty that he had accumulated since the time skip. And with us getting Dory and Brogy's bounties updated to 1.8 billion in the previous chapter, this really just goes to show how much of a threat to the world government that he is. And it's not surprising that he would be this powerful given everything the Giant Warrior Pirates have said about him and his confidence in his ability to wipe out entire pirate crews. But that begs the question, why does Loki have a bounty in the first place? Especially if he has already been captured and sentenced for death by the people of Elbaf. Now, as far as we know, Loki has not been traveling the world and causing havoc in recent years, meaning the world government must have become aware of his threat by some other means, and must still believe him to be alive. Well, bringing Shanks back to the equation, for over half a decade, fans have been wondering about the identity of the mysterious pirate that he discussed with the Five Elders. Could this actually have been about Loki? While we have not been told outright that Loki is a pirate, it would not surprise me if he's considered one for the purposes of their conversation, since after all, what are Vikings if not Scandinavian pirates? There are a bunch of other cool details in this exchange between Luffy and Loki, including a look at the giant hammer on his back, likely evoking Thor's Mjolnir from Norse mythology, and Loki also mistakenly refers to Luffy as Rhodey, which, funny enough, is something Luffy does to others on a frequent basis throughout the series, and for good measure, Rhodey is also the name of the bull mink that we first met on Zoe. But all of that said, my favorite part of this chapter is all of the details about Elbaf's geography and fauna, so let's talk about the Underworld. Now, this chapter gave us a ton of information about the mythology and beliefs of Elbaf, but it also confirmed a long-running theory. Loki explains that the tree he is chained to is none other than the jewel tree Adam. We first heard of this tree all the way back during the post-Enies Lobby arc, as Frankie explained that it was the strongest tree in the world. It's there that we learned that the tree existed on a war-torn island where cannonballs rained from the sky, and its inhabitants died alongside their structures, only for the people to rebuild their nations anew. Ever since we first got a glimpse of a giant tree-like structure silhouetted on Elbaf back during Big Mom's flashback, fans have long wondered if this could in fact be the jewel tree Adam. In that same flashback, we first saw the phrase Warland associated with Elbaf. Now, of course, we came to learn in the last chapter that Warland was actually the name of the kingdom, but ever since way back then, fans have been able to connect this land of war with the war-torn nation that Frankie spoke of. Not only that, in the last chapter, we saw cannons mounted on the upper level of the tree, which would allow for the cannonballs to rain down from the sky. Everything is coming full circle here, but if that was not enough, this notion of the tree surviving through the times of ruin and allowing for the people to rebuild anew very much lines up with the Norse mythology of Ragnarok, which is defined as this ultimate destruction of the gods in a cataclysmic battle with evil, out of which a new order will arise. This is it. We are approaching the end of the series in a monumental battle with Elbaf, the Land of War, at the center. But before we get too hyped up about this, we also have to talk about the lower level of Elbaf, being referred to as the Underworld. According to Loki, this place is considered a prison and an execution yard for criminals, being left to die in this cold tundra where the sun does not reach. The mountains are home to monstrous beasts, and in Elbaf myth are known as the First World, having existed for tens of thousands of years. There is a ton to unpack with this place, so let's just start with that. Of all the documented history in the story of One Piece, not much spans beyond 5,000 years in the past, with the existence of the Tree of Knowledge in Ohara being our oldest data point. The only thing that comes remotely close is the existence of the Alubarna Palace as far back as 4,000 years ago. So for the Underworld to have existed for tens of thousands of years means this is truly a primordial time, perhaps even before the dawn of man. It being a place where the sun is only a dead memory is very evocative of the Winter Solstice Festival that we learned of back during Big Mom's flashback. This festival involves a 12-day fast where the giants celebrate the death and rebirth of the sun, which in hindsight may likely be a nod to the cyclical nature of Ragnarok and the civilizations on Elbaf. This also plays very well with the logic of Luffy's devil fruit, as he seemingly had to die in order to be quote-unquote reborn and awaken as the sun god Nika. Though I am curious just how much of the lower level is considered to be the Underworld. As we saw, there do seem to exist settlements and structures outside of this mountainous region around the coast of the island, and up until now, our assumption was that the Elbaf village Big Mom was in during her flashback was on this lower level, though it is interesting that we don't actually see any of the sharp mountains of the First World anywhere in that distant background of the village. Could this flashback have actually taken place on the upper level? Perhaps that layer somehow has hills and grassy fields of its own with its own foliage. Now, of note, while it's not completely clear, it does seem like Saul was on the lower level somewhere back during Vegapunk's broadcast, given that you can see the mountains of the First World in the distance, but we'll talk more about Saul specifically at the end of the chapter. Now, my absolute favorite part of this chapter was the inclusion of these various animals that confront Luffy in the Underworld. This imagery of Luffy surrounded by 5 monstrous beasts is actually very reminiscent of the Starfall double-page spread from the previous arc, where he is similarly surrounded by the 5 elders in their full beast forms. However, this is also clearly a nod back to Luffy's time on Ruskaina, where he trained among the giant animals over the 2-year time skip. There, he ended up befriending many of them, much like he does in the scene, to the surprise of Loki and his followers. We've seen Luffy's ability to tame animals throughout the series, and over time, he's been able to immediately gain their trust and companionship as well. But the reason why I'm so excited about these animals in particular is because most of the beasts that we see in this chapter were actually designed by Oda for use in the One Piece film Strong World. Of the 5 monsters that confront Luffy, this here is a terror bear with huge beady eyes and elongated arms, and beside it is the Del Kong, a large fanged gorilla. The snake is reminiscent of the centipede snake with its triangular head and a strip of fur running down its backside, and beside it is the mammoth Dence, with the same scars on its body and tusks. Earlier in the chapter, when Loki let out a large yell, we saw a screen buffalo, and a bit later, we see Hiruden and Stanson having defeated what they call a moose, which is actually a Wintersaurus. When we revisit the Straw Hats on the ship outside Elbaf, you can make out a long sea creature in the back, which looks like a chomp shark. But if we take a look back at previous chapters, you'll see the Strong World designs don't necessarily stop here. In my 1128 breakdown, I pointed out how the Grasshopper motorcycle is very reminiscent of the GT7000 design from Strong World, and the Stingmore we saw also resembled the Joker bees. While this could be a stretch, one could even argue the giant walrus that we saw during Big Mom's flashback was a nod to the mountain walrus that we saw in the film. So, what does all of this mean? Well, like most movies, the events of Strong World are not canon. In that film, Shiki and his crewmate Dr. Indigo use a drug to mutate the fauna found on the island of Merville and end up creating many of the monsters that we see. However, this is only what happens in the movie. In Chapter 0, things are a little more ambiguous. For those unaware, Chapter 0 is a unique chapter that was released with Chapter 565 before the premiere of One Piece Strong World. This chapter is actually canon and gives us a lot of insight into the world leading up to and after Roger's execution, with Shiki's story being at the core. At the end of this chapter, we learn that Indigo has made a discovery about the plants and animals on the island and estimates that Shiki's plan will take approximately 20 years to come to fruition. This result of this plan is what we are seeing in Strong World. However, in the canon of the manga, this plan has yet to be set into motion. In fact, we don't even know what the plan actually is, and as such, it could end up diverging from what we saw in the movie. Indigo does mention in the chapter that the island is supported by various plant species that are not found elsewhere in the world, but as you can see, none of the animals in Chapter 0 have overlapped with the animals that we've seen on Elbaf, just yet. And that's important because Loki mentioned that he has been friends with the animals of the First World ever since he was a child. With Chapter 0 leaving off around 2 decades before the present day, it is very possible that Shiki is still out there and that his plan's timing aligns with his final war that we are steadily approaching. Who knows, maybe the presence of the Stronghold animals in this arc are hinting towards Shiki's formal debut in the present day. After all, many did speculate that the silhouetted man that we saw at the end of Chapter 1124 could be Shiki himself, given his vague resemblance to another character believed to be Shiki that we first saw in the Decks of the World cover story. We'll just have to see, but either way, I'm excited. And lastly, the presence of these animals really draws another striking parallel between Loki and Roto. Loki is confined to the Underworld, a prison for criminals, has a group of followers who are ultimately forced to obey him due to the presence of various giant beasts, and of course, Loki calls himself the Sun God. This is pretty much just like Roto, who also dubs himself the Sun God, uses a prison for his activities, and has followers who are forced into his worship thanks to the various animals in the area. It's seeming to me that Roto may have some sort of affinity for Loki, but we'll have to see where that goes. Back over on the bridge toward the upper lair, the other Straw Hats recognize Roto as the Sun God from before, but interestingly, he seems to be being chased by Goldberg and Gerd. I would guess that they are not happy about him having abducted the Straw Hats, and that this is all a misunderstanding from the crew's point of view, since they don't know yet that these giants are actually their allies. But what's interesting to me is that Goldberg is able to carry the Thousand Sunny like that. Over the past several chapters, we've talked about how there are some weird things going on with character sizes, which is not actually that out of the ordinary for One Piece, given how inconsistent Oda can be with his scaling. But as far as the Vivre cards are concerned, we know that the Thousand Sunny is 56 meters tall. Giants like Dory, Brogy, and Hiruden are all around 20 meters, give or take, and Gerd was listed in her Vivre cards to be around 17 meters tall. And given that we've seen Goldberg beside her and Hiruden before, he's likely in this range as well. So given all of that, it's likely that there is a mistake somewhere with regard to heights, probably with the Sunnies if I had to guess. But I should mention that there was a line earlier in this arc about how Roto was especially large, so who knows. Maybe these giants are even bigger than we think they're supposed to be. Either way, the most interesting part about this panel to me is that we see Goldberg's shield on his back, eyes closed. We've speculated if this shield was actually alive, given that it had eyes and a mouth, but since all we had at the time was one image, it wasn't clear if this was just a stagnant design. But as we can see here, this shield is asleep in this panel, indicating that it has sentience and may even be a homie. In which case, I would suspect that the shield was given life by Mother Carmel, since she was alive on Elbaf when he was born. Elsewhere in the Underworld, we find Hyrule and Stanson having taken down a moose, or as previously discussed, a Wintersaurus. Hyrule mentions that there are forests in the upper level, and that these animals are not found up there, which could further suggest that the Elbaf village we saw during Big Mom's flashback was in fact taking place up on that level. Now, Stanson mentions something about a painter being a sunstone. Given the context of them being unusable in the snow, it suggests to me that this is in reference to the sunstones used during the Viking Age in order to navigate with the sun. Stanson and Hyrule lift up the dinosaur-like monster and prepare to take it back up to the upper lair, as they walk off singing and dancing. This is quite reminiscent of Usopp and Luffy's relationship as well, particularly with their infatuation with Elbaf. It will be interesting to see how they get back up to the upper level, because so far all we know is of the wooden bridge that extends down to the castle area where the rest of the Straw Hats currently are. Speaking of the rest of the Straw Hats, we also check back in on the Giant Warrior Pirates and that half of the crew. In a very surprising turn of events, it seems Brooke has given Robin a haircut, once again giving her her iconic bangs from the pre-time skip. Funny enough, there have been multiple SBS questions inquiring about who it is that gives the Straw Hat crew their haircuts, and Oda had mentioned he wanted to draw a heartwarming scene just like this before. In Volume 70, Oda answered that it was probably Usopp or Robin, and later on in Volume 99, he added Sanji to the mix. Given that Usopp and Sanji are on Elbaf and Robin is the one needing the haircut, it looks like the responsibility has fallen to Brooke, who we know cherishes his hair himself. We also see Bonnie excited alongside the others, who we hadn't seen since the end of 1126, when the crew realized that they had been knocked out for 2 days, but we've yet to get an update on Kuma, so I'm looking forward to that. The Giants rejoice at the future reunion between Saul and Robin, and Brogy mentions Saul by name. This might mean that Dory and Brogy have likely met Saul by this point, and further suggests that the scholar they mentioned back on Egghead was Saul himself. Now, as they approach Elbaf, they mention the mists having cleared, which we saw surrounding the island a few days ago when the Kid Pirates entered the vicinity. I wonder if these mists are actually the product of the giant waterfalls that stream down from above. The chapter ends off on a very interesting cliffhanger, as we get a new giant calling out that Saul, who is now being referred to as a doctor, has fallen and is unable to get up. Now, the first level read of this is that Saul is in danger or hurt, which is certainly a possibility. This would be a pretty tragic twist though in the face of his reunion with Robin. However, I think there is another potential read of this line. As discussed earlier, when Saul was shown during Vegapunk's broadcast, it seemed he was on the layer where the mountains of the First World were visible. However here, these lines are coming from the upper layer, as evidenced by the branches and clouds. This makes me wonder if Saul having fallen is actually in reference to him having fallen down to the lower level, and if his inability to get up speaks to his inability to climb up to that layer. This could potentially be not as serious as Oda is making it out to be, but we'll just have to see next week. That's about it for everything I wanted to talk about in this chapter. There were a ton of crazy little details and a bunch of world building, and I'm interested in seeing what you thought in the comments. So if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.